So Joseph, are you gonna?
Yes, I'll go. Thank you. And speaking of thankless jobs, I'd like to welcome all the new board members. So my name is Joseph Condon. I'm here from the Community Housing Improvement Program. You have my written testimony. I'm not going to go through everything for the interest in the interest of time. I'll just highlight a couple things. The first thing I want to highlight is that CHIP membership and probably a lot of the rent-stabilized owners that our organizations represent up here are rent-stabilized because they were constructed prior to 1974. I point that out because it means they're rent-stabilized not in exchange for tax benefits or any type of subsidy. They are rent-stabilized because of their construction date, and therefore they're providing affordable low-market apartments, below-market apartments without that additional help from the government. Also, I mention it because turnover rates in pre-1974 rent-stabilized buildings are extremely low. They run around 10%, and that means for these rent-stabilized buildings, the primary way that owners can keep up with operating costs is through lease renewal increases. The same tenant is in place for a very long time. There's no vacancy increases. There's nothing during that time. Lease renewal increases are the primary way of those owners keeping up with expenses. So every time this board adopts a rent freeze or a rate lower than necessary to keep up with those increasing operating costs, it's really forcing owners to subsidize the difference, and it's kind of converting these buildings from private property into some sort of public assistance. So just wanted to point that out. I have some things to point out about NOI. As you know, we don't really believe that NOI is an accurate reflection of building finances, not only because it excludes capital costs, capital expenses, not only because it excludes debt service, not only because it excludes business taxes, but it also excludes certain operation and maintenance costs that should normally be picked up. And it's not necessarily the fault of the RGB staff. It's actually just a part of the Department of Finance policy and what they collect in RPIEs, on RPIEs. So in the back of my testimony, there's a sheet that's from the Department of Finance, and it lists all the ineligible items that can for RPIEs. I think there's about 115 items or so. There's a lot of them, but for example, professional fees are exempt, so architects, engineers, certiaries, environmental consultants, not allowed. Office equipment not allowed, appliances not allowed, municipal filing fees for permits or some of the reports that are required by the local laws that were mentioned, not eligible expenses, some actual maintenance items, pointing above $500 is not as an ineligible expense, piping installation, other types of maintenance on that ineligible expenses. So even though they're ineligible, these are all real costs that owners pay every year that don't get picked up as operational costs.
Actually, interesting there at the very bottom, eligible miscellaneous expenses. And there's 4.
Sundry,
special assessments, lease buyout, and petty cash.
yeah. Yeah, we don't make the rules.
But am I think I'm right, and if you disagree with what I'm about to say, please let me know. But our main concern is whether miscellaneous expenses grow faster than RPIE expenses, right? Or are you making a different claim that?
Well, I'm saying that that's a good question to ask. I mean, my first question is, can we actually capture the actual costs in the first place?
But for instance, if the percentage of your dollar of revenue that goes towards ineligible miscellaneous expenses remains constant over time, does the RGB care? Does it affect the RGBs? And would it affect, let's say there was a different set of miscellaneous expenses 20 years ago, and it was 1% or 4% or 5% of your dollar of revenue, and today it's a different basket, and it's also 5%, and it also increases at roughly the same rate as all your other expenses, it wouldn't really affect our analysis, would it? Or I'm asking as opposed to saying.
Well, I think it affects the analysis because they're not included as expenses when you calculate the NOI. So you're missing a chunk of expenses, a chunk of the expense profile.
Correct me if I'm wrong, I think what Joe is pointing out is that the cost-to-income ratio would be higher,
Right, but
which
if
would
there was,
lower the percentage of NOI that...
I understand that and I agree with that, but I guess if it's constant over time, that if we're looking at our, kind of what NOI was, like, it doesn't affect the change in NOI, it just affects what NOI itself is. So if we see constantly increasing NOI, even if it's not capturing miscellaneous expenses, it's still constantly increasing NOI.
The rate of change, it's a good question. I don't know. You can't determine the rate of change before you actually determine before you quantify what that item is first.
Unless we had a sense that ineligible miscellaneous expenses didn't increase at a proportion to other expenses.
I could tell you city filing fees increase every year, just about. Architects' professional fees increase every year. I would imagine a lot of these increase over time. Continuing with NOI, but not on the expense side.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
David, is your question about the share increasing of these expenses? Or
Both how big is it in absolute terms and whether the rate of change for miscellaneous expenses is different than the rate of change of all other, of captured expenses.
Okay.
And we can't answer that question. To the extent that you guys could provide us information that helps us answer that question, we could take it into account. But until it is kind of a black box, but until we have some data, we can't do anything with that black box.
Right. I mean, I am a proponent of adding something on the RPIE that says quantify your ineligible expenses. That would, I think, help maybe. I know you mentioned something about capital expenses before, and how do you get that number? DOF put something on the RPIE that asks for capital reserves or the amount of money that was set aside as capital reserves in a building. I asked a few of our members, they don't fill that out because not every owner or not every management company does it in that way. Sometimes they just, when there's a capital improvement to be made, it comes out of the budget and that's it. There's no reserves for it. So I would also propose maybe contacting Department of Finance and say, hey, we're trying to get this information. Just ask for the expenses. Don't ask for the amount set to reserve. If you made a capital improvement, how much did you spend on it? And that's it. I think you'll get more answers that way.
I'm sorry, were you going to finish reading? Or?
You can interrupt me, that's fine.
Okay. One of my concerns is that we are making a decision for all of New York City. And one of the points that's being made and emphasized today is that the data, specifically the NOI, isn't clear and shouldn't be relied on. But we also don't have, nor is it being provided, any data on how much landlords are making, specifically in profit. So is your claim that we can't derive from NOI the profits that landlords are making?
Can I answer that? Sorry.
Well, I'm not saying NOI is unreliable, saying it's incomplete.
I think NOI is devoted to three separate buckets. So it's, profit is one of them, but it's also debt payment and then reinvestment in the property. So it really depends on how a particular property's debt is structured, right? And so that could determine how much of their NOI is dedicated to repayment of mortgage versus profit or reinvestment in the property. It's very complicated. I guess my point is that, property to property, that number changes. So to give a blanket, assumption of what a property owner is assuming for profit is, I don't think anyone can do that.
There's at least some of the testimony does mention wages going up. And I know that in years past, at least from the tenant side, one of the arguments has been that we're in a housing crisis and that we should have some affordable rent increases, some of it being no rent increases. And then the response seems to be that that wouldn't be shouldered by landlords and the rent increases, but by wages. But I think my question here is, one question, do you believe that there's a housing crisis in New York City?
I do.
Who are you asking?
What?
Oh,
Is
I don't
this
think
for
we were
anybody?
sure
Yeah.
who you were asking.
Are you all saying yes?
Well,
Do you want us each to answer?
I can answer. I can say, yes, we do believe that there's a housing crisis.
And so so then when, as a board, when we're making this decision, we've been looking at expenses shouldered by landlords, but is it also fair to look at some expenses that are shouldered by tenants?
Yeah, I think there's this narrative out there that rent stabilized housing is affordable housing, and it's not tied to income, right? Some affordable housing is rent stabilized, but really to address the affordability crisis, the city has to produce more housing and more housing at the lower end. If you take a look at housing and vacancy survey information, the vacancy rate above 2755 is well above the vacancy the emergency threshold is at 7.5%. Meaning if you are earning six figures, you are spending less of your money on rent and you have lots of options. If you are making, say, $60,000 a year, you really are in a bind. You are spending way too much money on rent and you have zero options. The vacancy rate's like less than 1%. So I think to answer the question about housing affordability, yes, there's clearly a crisis, and it's a crisis that's taking place all across the world in major metropolitan regions because as the world's population moves into cities, cities have to produce enough housing, and it's just a simple supply-demand problem.
I mean, you can also think, to expand on that, not only is the vacancy rate high above the deregulation threshold, but the vacancy rate is above 5% for, I think, apartments renting at $1,800 or more. So an $1,800 apartment is affordable to a family of three that's making about 90% of AMI. So, I mean, when you ask, is there a housing crisis, I think the first question is, how do you define a housing crisis? And it's hard to answer because the housing market is diverse. There are, above a certain price point, the statutory definition of emergency doesn't apply because the vacancy rate's above 5%. So maybe there's an income crisis. Maybe there's a student debt crisis. Maybe there's a lot of different factors that go into housing affordability and not just how much the rent is.
Yeah, I'm really curious and I just wanted to hear more because I think sometimes we're looking at an overall policy question about shouldering burdens, and it tends to come up a lot when we're making our decision. And I know that at least previously, one of the things that's been said is about where should we pay our attention to? Should it be landlord wages, profits, expenses, tenants who are not able to find apartments, stay in apartments, afford the apartments? So I think it's helpful to hear, your viewpoints on that.
Yeah,
And it could be all of the above, but it's one of the things, when you say that there's not enough data, I think it complicates things from the data that we're looking at, because then, we begin to say, well, how much are landlords actually making? If if the NOI is inaccurate, then how much are landlords making? We do definitely have clear data about homelessness, about affordability. So it sort of fills in some gaps.
yeah. So we at CHIP are of course very concerned about housing affordability, and we are more than happy to sit down with you or with anyone around the table to try and to come up with solutions to housing affordability issues that exist today. But we also don't believe it's this board's responsibility to solve that issue, and that the deliberations should really just focus on the numbers. How much the expenses increase, how much of a rent increase is necessary to cover those expenses, and keep it simple.
And we do, but I think just to sum up on my point, is I think what I'm hearing is that some of the data we can't really rely on.
Like I said, it's
So that's
it's
where
not
I'm
that you
coming
can't rely on it, it's that it's incomplete, so you have to view it in that light, that there are other factors that are not being captured. There's expenses, operation and maintenance expenses that aren't being captured. There's double counting of income in certain situations. Okay, so this is the next point in my testimony.
Good segue.
You like? Yes, that was good. That was good. So back to NOI and the RPIEs. So on the RPIEs, on the instructions, the RPIE requests that So does everybody know how ScreenDree works? It's a sort of a rent freeze program, and the increases are given to the owner through tax abatements. So it's not actually income paid, but it's not actually income paid by the tenant. It's not income paid by like a Section 8 voucher. It's just a tax abatement. But on the RPIEs, the instructions say for owners to report the ScreenDree tax abatements as rental income. So on that's raising the rental income that's being represented in the RPIEs, and at the same time reducing the costs. But the owner's not actually receiving that income, so it inflates the gap, so to speak. And I included that instruction in the back of my testimony, so you can verify.
So, Joseph, obviously we'd have to look at that, but if the staff agreed with you in terms of that analysis, what would be your recommendation to correct that double counting?
You would just have to back out the ScreenDree abatements from the income side of the equation.
But aren't you not paying, in other words, if I have $5 in my hand and I have to give that $5 away, but I get to keep the $5, that's what you might not be, it's got to be counted somewhere, because you're actually not, like I do taxes, and if you get a debt forgiveness, IRS is counting that as income, because you've been forgiven a debt, and you had a debt to the state, you are being forgiven that debt, so it's now something that you benefit from.
Okay.
I mean, it's got to be weighed somewhere, because in other words, if it didn't weigh somewhere, you would have had to pay that money.
So the RPI is supposed to just measure rent collected. This rent is not being collected.
I think that in the spirit, it's trying to measure what's your gain. In other words, rent collected is one gain. The fact that you're not paying the state something that the state is entitled to, because we're saying, hey, this senior, that's still, either the senior's giving you the $5 and then you're going to pay taxes on it, right? Or you're not going to pay taxes on it. Point is, you're not you're not losing something, you're still gaining, you're gaining something. The same way a credit card company is telling you your debt forgiveness, and then the IRS says, oh, well, you got to pay taxes on that debt because you've gained that as income.
I'm not an accountant, but to me, it seems like double counting.
If you're, just think of it in this way, that someone has, if you owe something to MasterCard, Visa, wherever, and they say, okay, we'll forgive it, IRS is going to say, wait a second, you gained something by that. So that's why we're counting it against you. And that's, in this way, we're counting against you because you are no longer paying that to the state. That's cash you kept in your bank, not paid it to the state.
Why don't we read it? We can reconvene.
Okay, we can,
Doesn't matter. Yeah, maybe at some point you can give us the staff's opinion on that? Not necessarily now, but if you want to.
Right. I can say that there's about 50,000 units getting scree.
I think there's like, scree and dree together, I think there's like 60 to 65,000.
Oh, with DRE, it
Yeah.
may be, yeah, it could be 60.
And I think it's about average $400 per month.
per person.
Per person, yeah, per person.
per apartment.
No,
That's
per
not a low number, yeah.
scree or dree recipient.
$5,000 a year times 60,000
That's
units
per
is
I don't know, I'm not that good
30
at math.
million, three.
Where's my phone? Where's my other phone?
Oh, it's in
The
there. Okay.
INA
Yeah, yeah.
follow-up memo that's in your folders has that information on it. I think it's
Okay.
the first question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, my read is that you're making a good point. I wonder if you kind of then,
4 million.
if you deducted that from the total of all rent, I wonder how meaningful it is. I think it's a good point, but I wonder if it's a significant change in.
Yeah, well, given the 60,000 or so
Yeah.
recipients and the about
400,
300 to 400 average, it's a pretty big chunk, I think.
24 million.
Yeah, that's it. There you go.
Yeah, and I'd have to check with RPI, the finance, how they calculate the tax portion of it, to make sure that they're including that abatement in when they calculate the tax bill. I believe they are, but I could double check that. Because in that, if they weren't, then it wouldn't be double dipping. Would you agree with that? If it's not in.
Yeah, but I
yeah.
think they report the tax that's actually paid, right?
I believe so, but I can double check to make sure they're including the abatements, not abatement,
Just try to make it fair.
yeah, I'll ask.
Let's try to make it fair.
Okay, just one more thing I have on NOI, and I know that the 0.4% number was reported, but it also, maybe this is more of a question. So last year, inflation-adjusted NOI was reported as having increased 64% since 1990. This year, inflation-adjusted NOI was measured as having only increased 53% since 1990. So that's an 11 percentage point difference, a decline, but the NOI is still reported at 0.4%, and I was just wondering,
That calculation is simply a point-to-point. So whatever it was in 1990, just for inflation, in 2016, it was at 61% or whatever. So because NOI didn't rise at the same rate, we could expect the next year that point-to-point comparison the growth would go down from those 2 points. So you have to look at it from a point-to-point, but you can't take a look at one year to the next and say it should be a decline, because we're just taking it from a point-to-point, and then we're adjusting for inflation. And when you adjust for inflation, you're adjusting every year.
It's all based from the same point, though, from
Yes,
1990.
right, it's the same point. But you could take any point within that graph that we have, and you could take 2000 to now, you could take 2005, whatever point to point. We just simply start that point to point because that's when the data came. But you could go to any other point to point. And, if you feel there's different points in history where the real estate industry, was either doing better or worse, you could take those point to point, and say this is the growth from say 2008 to now. It's just a point. The key is it's point to point. It's not.
I mean, Andrew, if I may be misunderstanding, but it sounds like what Joseph is saying is if from 1990 to 2016, you had a 64% increase in NOI, or from 1990 to 2017, it was only a 53% increase in NOI, which would imply that between 16 and 17, it went down. Is that your point?
Yeah.
So I don't understand why he's not right.
No, because you're adjusting for inflation each year. So you have to go back and do it. You have to go back because it's going to adjust every single year for the different inflation that's happening.
So you're implying that inflation was very high in 2017 is the implication.
Yeah, no, it's because it's a point-to-point comparison. But I mean, I can try to write something to explain.
Yeah, we'll look into that.
Can you explain it to us lay people?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning of the testimony of the 500,000 units represented by CHIP's membership.
Yes.
That none of it, or very little of it, it receives tax abatements or exemptions. So in terms, so I presume that means 421A. But then there are other programs where the city provided, funding for or assistance with capital improvements, participation loan program, Article 8A, et cetera. And I believe, though I could be wrong, that they also involve tax breaks, property tax abatements and the like. So I was just wondering if you're saying that none of these owners ever receive these kinds of assistance from the city.
I can't say every single one, but the large majority do not. No, people have stopped taking J51s. Obviously, they're not new developments, so there's no 421As there. So yeah, it's all construction date-based regulated stock.
Thanks.
So I think I just have like 2 or 3 more points. Also, in the back of your testimony, in the back of my testimony, is a chart which sort of graphs the one-year guidelines adopted by this board since 2008 and the CPI adjusted commensurate one-year lease recommendation made by the staff or reported by the staff. And I just wanted to illustrate sort of the gap as you get further out from an initial tenancy, from a new tenant taking occupancy, the gap grows year after year after year. And I guess that's part of one of the reasons we would ask this board to consider a vacancy increase if it were to be eliminated in Albany, because this gap is problematic, and if there's no way to recover for the owner once that longtime tenant vacates and a new tenant takes occupancy, it's very dramatic. It's very harmful to building finances.
Just to be clear on that, Joseph, though, your chart doesn't take into account vacancies, and if 10% of units are vacated every year, then in terms of actual performance, that gap would either narrow or disappear, or actually may flip, right?
When you say, I don't know. Well, the point of I think the point of the chart is to illustrate what happens if there aren't vacancies.
So if this would be for an apartment with no vacancies between 2008 and 2018, if they renewed one-year lease every year, that would be the situation. But just to be clear, that's just one scenario out of many in terms of any individual apartment.
True, but I also mentioned before that the vacancy rate in pre-1974 buildings is extremely low. It's about 10%. Annually, yeah.
But then you get so kind of in theory, then 100% of these units would turn over in 10 years, or some variant. I mean, some If you have 1,000 units, you'd have 1,000 vacancies over 10 years.
Yes, I guess so, yes.
So if you took into account, so the graph says what it says, but if you took into account vacancies, you would have a different actual
Yes.
result.
And I think I intentionally didn't use the, I know there's also a commensurate that considers
Yeah.
vacancies,
Yeah, yeah,
yes.
yeah. Okay, just to understand.
One of my points is also that those type inadequate guidelines over time also put upward pressure on fair market rents or unregulated rents, because owners are forced to push the limits on these unregulated rents in an attempt to cover not only that unregulated market's operational costs, but also the regulated apartments who are not meeting their operational
So in
cost
other words,
burden.
you may have a building where you have X number of units really paying a lower because they had less vacancies, right? And then one that maybe turned over 1 or 2 times, and they have to offset that cost.
Right, yes.
Could you, Joseph, could you explain kind of like the model that you have in mind? Because I would think if I was a landlord, I would just charge whatever the market could bear, whatever constraints I faced. Like why would a landlord charge less for a market rate apartment because he's getting more for a rent regulated apartment?
Well, the model is if there was no rent regulation, right? And that was sort of the situation. The lowest rent apartments would move up, and the highest rent apartments would move down, and that's sort of what this is based on.
But you made a different, your point was a different point, which is that inadequate guidelines put upward pressure on fair market rents. So if there's, let's say we raised fair market, let's say we raised guidelines 7%. Mm-hmm. Are you making the claim that that would reduce rents for the market rate apartments?
It would, yes.
Why? I don't follow.
There wouldn't be that pressure to continually increase those rents, the market rate apartments.
Does that follow? I'm not sure if that follows.
I think he's missing your point. You're saying inadequate. Are you sure you're understanding his point? He's saying inadequate rent increases on the rent stabilized housing stock should create upward pressure on the market rate stock in mixed buildings. Because the person is still going to balance their NOI. So if the expenses are going up 5%, the building's going to have to find a way to pay for them.
No, but I mean, I may be missing, I think this is basic econ 101, but are you going to say the landlord's going to charge whatever rent he can get? Like, whether, if I'm making a low profit here, I'm not going to change, I'm still going to charge the market price over here. I mean, I get your point. If you got rid of rent regulation, then rents will kind of equalize between the two stocks, the regulated and the unregulated.
Right.
But it's not clear to me that if we gave higher increases, that would lower the pressure to increase rents on the unregulated stock.
Right, because that would owners have to make up the revenue somewhere. When stabilized apartments are kept at a low increase or none, which it had been for a couple of years over the last 5-year period, then owners have to make up the revenue somewhere else, and that's why.
They would have above market rents.
And then you would have
if the
constant
tenant
turnover.
left, the owner would have to do that, but some tenants won't leave because they know they're only going to live there another year. So they're like, okay, I'm just going to pay it.
I'm not sure, yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm in the minority here, but I'm not sure if I agree.
Economics of just the building. Just
But,
balancing
I mean, the landlord charges the rent that the market will bear. The landlord doesn't say, I need to make $1 million in rent roll this year. The landlord says, hey, let me market this apartment at the market rent, and then I'm going to charge the market rent. That's what the landlord says for the market rate apartments.
Yes, but, go ahead,
You can
Patty.
only charge so much, and if you keep, let's say you're at the market, they can even go down the block and go somewhere else and get a better deal. So it's constant turnover, the owner loses money that way. Because yes, you can charge market, but if you're not getting enough increases here, you need to charge more than market, is what he's saying. At the, for the other apartments.
I mean, I understand, I think I'm disagreeing, but I think I understand the argument. But
The market is not completely efficient, right? Like, the market value of the apartment is somewhat dependent by you. If you have elasticity in income. You don't know if your apartment's worth $5,000 or $5,050. But maybe $5,050 is what it takes to run the building, but the market is $5,000. Are you gonna upend your whole life over $50? If your income is elastic, you probably won't. I think that's your point.
Yes.
I mean, we're talking around the margins. We're
Okay,
talking
okay.
$50 and $75 increments. We're not talking about the market rent's $5,000 and you charge $7,000 because you're trying to make the building. We're talking about stuff that is a little bit more just trying to balance a budget. So all the market rate tenants are paying $75 more, but you've got 100 of them. So there you just solve $75,000 in problem.
So yeah, so that's sort of the theory, and also that by doing that, the RGB is essentially confiscating those rents from the free market units and using them to forcing the owner to use them to subsidize the lower rent units. So I will wrap up real quick. Preliminary guidelines. We would like to ask this board to consider a broad range of preliminary guidelines. God bless you. And especially because we don't know what's going to happen in Albany. So obviously, I think the floor would be the 1 year vacancy, the 1 year commensurate that considers the vacancy renewals. But I do think the ceiling should be the commensurate that doesn't consider the vacancy renewals, because that's a very real possibility. I mean, you can obviously play with it if you're also going to consider maybe a vacancy allowance from the board as well. But that's really something that we would like to see, so that the board has some flexibility. I know we mentioned that you can still probably do something even if you don't put it in the preliminary guideline, but I think it would help the conversation if it was put out there ahead of time. And the last piece is sort of, I'm sure you sort of got the gist of this throughout my testimony, but at CHIP we believe that the RGB's duty, that its mandate is really just an extension of what the intent of the rent stabilization law is, which is to prevent speculative, unwarranted, and abnormal increases in rents. And when this board reports a 5.5% increase in the PIOC, it's very hard to see how an equivalent rent increase would be speculative, unwarranted, or abnormal, especially in the light of the fact that since I think 2014 or 2015, there's been a rent freeze or very close to it. And I mentioned before, CHIP and its membership, we are deeply concerned with the issues of housing affordability, but we don't think this is the proper forum for that policy discussion. The commensurate adjustments that are calculated by the RGB really already perform the intent of the statute by, measuring what's necessary and preventing excessive rent increases and profiteering by setting what those reasonable rent increases should be to keep building revenue in proportion with operating expenses. So to further discount those numbers based on tenant affordability really starts to transform rent stabilization from sort of a price control mechanism to what I would call an off-budget housing subsidy. And basically you're confiscating property and transferring it from one person to another. And we are more than willing to explore reasonable policy solutions to ensure housing affordability to low and moderate income families. CHIP members are very cognizant of and concerned about the need for this type of housing, especially partly because that responsibility has been placed on them by this board in some instances for a long time. This year, our members are asking that the burden for housing affordability be placed where it lawfully belongs, which is on the purse of the state and the city government. Our members really are becoming frustrated with having to participate in this sort of off-budget scheme where they are forced to shoulder the burdens of what really should be a burden that's borne by society as a whole. And that's the end.
I
have one kind of additional comment. I think I've asked this in previous years, just to Mary Ann's testimony, because I think some members may be aware of this, but some members may not. So unsold co-op shares have to report annually to the Attorney General of the unsold, how the sponsor is able to pay for the unsold co-op shares. And I can tell you, if we could get the data, it would prove in 100% of the cases, the unsold co-ops, their monthly expenses to run the unit are far in excess of the rent stabilized rent that the unit covers. Have we ever asked for that data from the state? I've had to do it because I've worked in a company that owned, unsold co-op shares that didn't cover it, and we had to annually produce how we could economically continue to shoulder that burden. And there's hundreds and hundreds of these units across the city. I do agree it's a small spectrum, but it does deal a little bit with just this cross-subsidy issue that we have been talking about, but it is well documented in our kind of policy world of the Attorney General.
We could, we can request the data.
Thank you, Joseph. Any other questions for Joseph? Okay. Oh,
It was a hot bench, so I'm glad there's no more.
thank you. Paimaan? Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah.
Yes. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Which one, is it, is this what we're looking at, or?
This is my
Oh, sorry.
So read, but then there's an attachment, which is the
Got it.
document you just held up.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, board members. My name is Paimaan Lodhi, Senior Vice President with the Real Estate Board of New York. I thank you this afternoon for the opportunity to provide our perspective regarding rent adjustments for the city's rent-regulated apartments. New York City is a city of renters of approximately 3.2 million units of housing in New York. 68% are rental units, and 38% of its total housing inventory is rent-regulated. The current rent-regulated system has allowed for continued capital investment in buildings that have resulted in a historically low dilapidation rate of 0.2% citywide. With 71% of the rent-stabilized housing stock built prior to 1947, maintenance and operational costs are expected to rise as these older buildings will require major system overhauls over time. Rent Guidelines Board increases play a critical role in combination with levers permitted under the rent stabilization law, such as MCIs, IAIs, and vacancy allowance. They provide important funding streams to keep buildings in a state of good repair. Recently, policy leaders and advocates have proposed drastic and sweeping changes to the rent regulation system without a detailed analysis of the consequences or an appreciation of the interconnectedness of the system. Changes that severely limit or eliminate necessary streams of revenue will lead to deteriorating housing conditions, discourage the creation of new stabilized housing needed to alleviate the housing crisis, and hurt the households most in need of help. The real estate industry acknowledges that changes are necessary to increase transparency and better protect tenants from a minority of unscrupulous landlords. To be clear, we are not calling for the end of the rent-regulated system, as these units serve an important role in providing safe housing to many New Yorkers. What is needed is responsible rent reform that protects tenants while maintaining the quality of our housing stock. The Rent Guidelines Board staff should be commended for the vast information they provide and the clarity with which they present the many challenges in the data. Those challenges have led to a system ill-equipped to match appropriate rent increases with expenses over time. The rate of RGB allowed rent increases has not kept up with the rate of annual expense growth. Over a 20-year period and across multiple mayoral administrations, the Rent Guidelines Board increases averaged 2.7%, while expenses for property owners increased more than twice that rate at 5.5%. This incongruence is a result of a highly politicized process that relies on a flawed methodology that artificially inflates NOI and arbitrarily reduces expenses. Data used by the RGB staff to calculate NOI is incomplete and inaccurate. An outdated 27-year-old analysis by the Rent Guidelines Board and the Department of Finance is used as a basis for adjusting expenses downward 8%. Similarly, costs of building facade maintenance increased elevator inspections, lead paint abatement, and any other government mandates imposed since the price index was updated 35 years ago are not considered by the board. Additionally, while the Rent Guidelines Board studies exclude smaller 1 to 10 unit buildings, they do include larger buildings with at least one rent-stabilized unit. And using this low threshold, it inevitably captures buildings created through programs like 421A that include predominantly unregulated units. Aggregating these newly built units whose initial rent is at market with the older rent-regulated units whose baseline rent may have been established 50 years ago greatly inflates reported income for rent-stabilized buildings. As a result, the report is likely to show a growth in income which does not reflect the reality of buildings which contain predominantly rent-stabilized units, especially the over 16,000 fully stabilized buildings throughout the city. Finally, NOI as calculated by the RGB omits three significant expenses: capital reserves and expenditures, business taxes, and most importantly, debt service. In spite of methodology that results in an overstatement of a building's NOI, this year's RGB income and expense study shows a stagnant 0.4% increase in NOI. New York City's real property tax system places an inequitable financial burden on rental apartment buildings in a number of ways. One way is the disproportionate share of the tax levy imposed on these properties compared to their share of the city's market value. Since 2007, the property tax levy for Class 2 has increased from $5.2 billion to $10.8 billion, a 107% increase, an annual average of 8.9%. This increase falls disproportionately on the rental properties in this class, largely due to a provision in state law that requires that co-ops and condos be valued based on comparable rental property. As taxes on apartment rentals have increased, some properties are now being taxed in excess of 30% of their gross income. Proposed changes to the rent regulation system contemplate the wholesale elimination of increases beyond those provided by the Rent Guidelines Board, including the vacancy allowance, MCI, IAI, luxury decontrol, and preferential rents. To better understand the impacts of any changes to the rent regulation system, REBNY commissioned the consulting group of HRNA advisors to develop models that could analyze changes to various building typologies. The results were startling. The legislative proposals would dramatically change the economic viability of the operations and maintenance assumptions for apartment buildings across the city. Within 5 years, approximately 414,000 units could be financially distressed and won't be able to afford any investment beyond basic maintenance, taxes, and utilities. Many of these buildings are owned by small landlords. This will create a burden for tenants of smaller landlords who will not be able to reinvest to maintain the quality of their properties. Without a mechanism to recoup capital improvements, owners will undertake less work and housing quality will deteriorate. As NOI decreases across these buildings, the DOF's property assessments and related tax bills will be adjusted downward. The potential policy changes to rent stabilization could reduce annual property tax revenue by up to $5 billion annually due to steep drops in real estate values, as calculated by an analysis by HRNA. Finally, if the proposed funding streams are eliminated, it will place greater pressure on the Rent Guidelines Board to raise rents approximately 7.5% annually to make up the difference. This is not the kind of rent reform that helps tenants and owners, and to be clear, that's not what we're asking for. But again, I think what this is doing is highlighting the interconnectedness of the system. You shut off funding streams at the state level with MCIs, IAIs, vacancy allowance. It just places greater burden on the Rent Guidelines Board to make up that difference. Current legislative proposals that would eliminate all funding streams beyond Rent Guideline Board increases will have negative impacts on NOI and are highly untenable for the city's housing stock. This board has an opportunity to be responsible, to rely on the data presented, and to provide increases that continue to allow for maintenance of quality housing for millions of New Yorkers. It is no secret that this process and historic results are ones that landlords and tenants alike find frustrating. This challenge provides an opportunity for responsible rent reform. Serious consideration should be given to moving to a new standard model that inputs various indices for generating Rent Guideline Board increases that can operate independent of political machinations. This board's determination should be the result of a consistent framework year to year to provide predictability in balancing tenant and landlord needs. Public input is an important part of good government, and it should be used to provide data discrepancies, new methodologies, or to highlight sudden shifts in the market. We believe there are merits to a formula system, and therefore suggest a formula that encompasses the following: CPI and wage growth, property taxes, unfunded regulatory requirements, subsidized regulatory requirements, labor, maintenance, insurance, administrative costs, capital investment needs, debt service, utilities such as energy, water, sewer, and fuel. In conclusion, capital investment is the lifeblood of rental housing. Rental housing with a steady and reliable stream of capital thrives. And conversely, tenants suffer when revenue is lacking or constrained by unrealistic restrictions on rent growth. The city is experiencing an affordability crisis that impacts hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers, both in and out of the rent-stabilized housing system. If current tenant income is warranted as a consideration for rent increases, then the regulatory framework needs to change from stabilization to one based on rent burden. An income-based system must include subsidy to either tenant or landlord to maintain current levels of maintenance and investment. It does not serve the public to solve for housing affordability and not for quality. New Yorkers deserve responsible policies that support existing high-quality rental stock and encourages the construction of more housing to increase supply and ease vacancy rates at lower rent levels. Again, I've attached this report, which gives our complete analysis. It has information on the housing landscape, vacancy rates across the board, used a lot, referencing RGB data, and then gets into the pro formas of the prototypes that we analyzed and the dramatic increase or the dramatic decrease in NOI within a short period of time for these prototypes.
Is this the HRA report that you referenced in your testimony?
This isn't the complete, yes, but this is the work that they've, yeah. Yes, thank you. What's that? Is there a complete report? Yes.
Can you share that with us?
Yes, we will.
So I'm looking at the report, not your testimony, the report, but page 9 and 10, where I guess these are your pro formas. So one of the black boxes that we face is about debt service.
Yeah.
And so it looks, and one thing that I've spoken about with Andrew and with other members of the board over the last couple of years is like, how can we model this somehow? And like, given standard terms for commercial multifamily mortgages and given interest rates over the last 5 to 10 years, can we kind of model the impact that it has on the stabilized housing stock? Is this kind of information that's on page 9 and 10, would that help us do that?
I think what we did was we took, some of the housing advocates at their word and, took a look at what the Assembly press release stated, which was the elimination of all these other funding streams, and assumed, rent guideline board increases and expenses would be held consistent over time. And so what we did was model that over, a 5-year period of time to take a look at how NOI would be impacted.
I'm sorry, but the part that I find really interesting about this is that you have, pro formas for a $100,000 loan per unit and a $50,000 loan per unit. So where are those numbers coming from, and would that help us kind of get inside the black box of debt service that's a black box for us at the RGB?
So the $50,000 limit that we have placed here is just a very conservative and low number. In fact, when we had shared this with other landlords, they were astounded. Their debt carry per unit was upwards of $250, right? So there is great variability in the entire system. What we tried to do was, again, take a conservative approach and model it over a short period of time. And, again, the results were a bit scary. It would result in 414,000 units being in financial distress within a short order of time.
I would just say personally, and I don't know about the other members of the board, but if if HRNA were able to kind of give us a model, conservative model, the one that your members say is more realistic model, and kind of give us a pro forma for debt service, I would find that really interesting.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a question about your comment about the NOI figures being perhaps misleading in that it includes buildings with a small number of rent-stabilized units and in buildings with a large number of rent-stabilized units. I was looking at the income and expense study, which showing the trends in NOI, both overall by borough and also the longitudinal study. It's interesting that the only decrease is actually in Manhattan, where you have a larger proportion of units, of buildings with market rate and rent-stabilized units combined. If you look at the other boroughs, actually rent NOI has gone up, and especially in the smaller, overall in the smaller buildings. And I think a lot of this has to do with the commercial rents going down in Manhattan. So I'm not quite sure I buy the argument that the inclusion of sort of hybrid buildings with market rate and rent-stabilized buildings, causes NOI to be.
Well, I think I think the point was that it's not an accurate reflection of the NOI for, the entire market. And when you, again, policies are being done or enacted that are going to affect the entire system. Right. And, you cannot treat an 80-20 building's NOI the same as you would a fully rent-stabilized building. And,
Right.
There are 16,000 fully stabilized buildings throughout the city. Their NOIs are nowhere close to Manhattan 80-20.
Right. But I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that the income and expense study breaks it down by borough, so you can look at places where there's more 100% rent-stabilized buildings, and you look at the NOI. So we're not just looking at a single figure for the city overall.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. I think one problem, though, is that it doesn't include those units under 10, those buildings under 10 units.
That's true.
And, the majority of those 16,000 fully stabilized units are 1 to 10.
Any questions from the members? Thank you.
Thank you guys for your time.
Thank you all. So we have like 7 minutes. We'll start up again at 3. Is that okay?